But anyway, yeah, Michael Miller. He is a former college instructor with a PhD in philosophy, and yeah, we'd love for you guys to meet him. So, what is up, Michael Miller?
Hey, what's up, guys? Thanks for having me on.
Dude, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Like I said, it's great to see your wonderful face again. I just wish I could caress your cheeks.
Yeah, man, I wish we could hug real big, but
Yeah.
you know, right now it's not possible. So, but it's nice to see you. It's very good to see you and hear your voice, and I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Hell yeah, man. Yeah, like I said, thank you for agreeing to come on here. I think it's important to get all kinds of different voices, and obviously there are so many people who are much smarter than we are out there, and so never try to pretend like I'm an authority on anything, but it's nice to talk to people who are, more well-versed than we are in these subjects, so...
Well, I mean, I am not an expert. Like I am just somebody who has like too much education, and I'm a nerd about things. So I like do a lot of research, and luckily I still have a university job, so I have access to like JSTOR and things like that. So I can do research, which is pretty nice.
Awesome.
So I just before we get started, I do want to point out that you guys should really look into Ron Paul's racism, because he's a huge racist. So, Ron Paul's terrible. He fucking sucks.
Right.
But anyway, So
no,
I'm ready to start.
Not advocating. I've said this a couple times on this show, but there was a time where I was considering myself a libertarian.
Right.
Not really understanding what that meant at all, just that I was like, oh, I hate the system. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, dude, I mean, I feel like we maybe have similar trajectories, because I grew up basically in a family where my dad was big into libertarianism. He took me to Second Amendment rallies, and we would go see like a local talk show guy in Detroit called Mark Scott, who was a big libertarian back in the 80s and 90s, and I learned how to fire weapons and use firearms. It was basically like that sort of oh, don't tread on me, small government, Second Amendment, that sort of libertarianist type stuff. He was into Ayn Rand for a minute, stuff like that.
He was.
Of course, yeah. But now he's pretty much a full blown Trumper, which sucks. So there's a bit of tension there. I tried to explain to him what libertarian socialism was, and I didn't use the word anarchism. And basically, he was perplexed, right? Because to somebody like that, it sounds like an absolute contradiction, right?
Right.
But we'll get into that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to learn the fact that libertarian, because when you look up the definition of libertarian, it seems wonderful. It's well, why wouldn't you think that? You are considered personal property. You have your, rights and freedoms, liberty.
Right.
So why wouldn't you think that's a good thing? But then it is clearly co-opted by the right.
Yeah. So I mean, a lot of the stuff that libertarians talk about does kind of derive from what's called classical liberalism, which we'll talk about. And there's actually a lot to like there. There's problems with it. It doesn't go far enough in some ways, but there's actually, especially when you go back and read somebody like, say, Adam Smith, there's a lot to not like about it. But then there are also parts about what Adam Smith says in various places that the sort of right wingers like to push under the rug.
They cherry pick for sure.
Yeah, cherry picking things. I mean, and it's easy to do this with any kind of thinker or philosophical movement. You can sort of distort things, cherry pick, and I like the idea of we have to always be wary that political concepts of political theory, especially labels, they're highly normative, which is to say that they're the kind of concepts that people fight over and they use as bludgeons to beat other people up with. And so there's a lot of disputation over what these concepts mean, and there's a lot of semantic drift. So I think it's important to, in order to understand any of this stuff, you got to do like a Nietzschean like genealogy of like dig into the history of the concepts and how people were using these words and these terms in different times and different periods of history under different situation, and then you kind of see where the threads go.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting when you do that. I mean, especially if you're a nerd like me, and you like to get into the nitty-gritty of things. So yeah, it's but yeah, there are some basic things that are to be found in classical liberalism that I think are actually pretty attractive. And when people go online and in leftist like circles and say, "Oh, you're a liberal. Oh, that's just some liberal bullshit," right? I mean, that's just like used as a pejorative, as a term of abuse, which I get. I mean, because your standard liberal is somebody who like is glued to like, I don't know, MSNBC or whatever, and is just very like centrist and unthinking about what their politics are. And so I get that, but I think it's important to sort of define our terms and talk about them in historical context as well.
Sure. Yeah. So do you want to go ahead and dive on in? Like what
Sure.
What do we need to start with as far as definitions go?
So let me just give a basic taxonomy of a few different like sort of core basic sort of core commitments of like liberalism, conservatism, fascism, and then we'll get into socialism.
Great.
So starting with classical liberalism. So as you kind of mentioned when you're talking about libertarians, there's that notion of individual freedom, right? That's basically this idea that as long as you're not harming anyone, you should be allowed to pursue whatever goals you have, fulfill whatever desires you have, without outside interference from an external force like the government or religious authority telling you what to do or how to live, right? So that's this notion of liberty as like just non-interference by external forces. Sure. And that sounds pretty good, right?
Yeah.
This doesn't seem. I mean, I don't want that. Yeah, that's pretty good. I don't want the Pope or like some religious authority telling me what I can and can't do and how to live and what desires I can fulfill and what I can't. I don't want the government telling me that either. Mandating things. That's reasonable. Another core commitment is pluralism, about pursuing happiness, like self-determination about how to live your own life and what constitutes a good life for you. The government doesn't tell you like that you have to get married and have a family and have children or whatever, right? Like maybe you would in a religious theocracy, like it would be against the law not to do that or something, right?
Right.
So there's a pluralism about like, how to live and what your own good is. Another component is the rule of law. This is really important. I mean, under any version of socialism worth having, we'd still want this, where everyone is equally subject to the law. There's separation of powers. There's no monarch or autocrat issuing arbitrary fiats telling you, again, how to live or what to do, or, getting their friends off and getting their enemies imprisoned or whatever. Another thing in classical liberalism is the idea of property rights and contracts. Those are enforced by the state. That's like, one of the main roles of the state is to enforce that stuff. Another component is representative democracy. Now, here's the thing. Representative democracy is actually good. Representation is good because you really wouldn't be able to have a true direct democracy because there's just too many people and too many people who don't.
Absolutely.
Yeah, too many people who don't have like expertise on various topics. They'd have to sit down. After you're done doing your job, you'd have to sit there and do a bunch of homework on like some arcane tax policy. So we do need representatives. The problem is that in liberalism, they tends to be representative democracy of the elite variety, right? That where there's representatives tend to come from an elite sort of class, right? And you can see, like, if you look at America, how many of these people went to like elite universities and things like that, or already part of a sort of elite class. Right. Another thing in classical liberalism is this idea of market capitalism being the best engine of growth and wealth generation, and thus the preferred economic system. But we have to be aware here that classical liberalism it was developed in like the 1700s, and this is like pre-industrial era, right? Just the beginning of when industrialization is starting to happen. So really, like guys like Adam Smith and John Locke were really, they were all about small proprietors and yeoman farmers and people who are like that was the ideal social formation, not like giant corporations. You know, they these guys kind of actually wanted everybody to be like their own boss, ideally, right? So there really is an element of that in classical liberalism that gets distorted and perverted once post industrialization. And in fact, classical liberals have there's very a bunch of examples of them talking about some amount of like government assistance or social programs that's needed to offset like the effects of like drudgery and work under things like the division of labor. So Adam Smith talks about, so we have a division of labor. We have everybody's making specialized little bits of the thing on the assembly line. And so you're just responsible for doing just that one little thing or a couple little routine actions or whatever. And he says that can like stultify and like stupefy you, right?
Yeah,
and
absolutely. He thought your soul out.
Yeah, right. And in fact, Marx picks up on that thing that Adam Smith says in book 5 of The Wealth of Nations, and like Marx runs with that. But
what does he call it? He calls it like worker alienation, I believe. Is that
right? So you're alienated from your labor. Yeah. So Smith wanted public education, because he wanted people to be able to develop their intellect, because he thought that this kind of work was like going to sort of dumb you down. So he said, well, we have to offset that with something like public education, which again, this is not like totally libertarian, like no public anything, right? I mean, it's more complex than that, right?
Yeah.
So again, classical liberalism, it's like in the 1700s that this is developing. But as we go forward, liberalism develops because it develops alongside a bunch of historical developments like industrialization, especially. So later you get two kind of like a left and a right wing of liberalism, I would say. The left wing of liberalism is often called like welfare state liberalism. Sometimes it's called the post-war consensus or social democracy. And this is like really got going like post-World War II. Okay. And also, well, I mean, you had the like FDR, the New Deal era as well, sort of contributing to this. So the idea is something like this. And the Great Depression obviously was a big catalyst in being like, oh shit, maybe we need a welfare state. So part of it, a core commitment is recognition that capitalism creates inequality and unjust wealth concentration. Still, capitalism is good. We need to keep capitalism, but it needs regulations. It needs oversight. We get the rise of robber barons and Carnegie and all these kind of big sort of robber baron types that are just like exploiting the workers, and that is bad. So we need to kind of mitigate that. And you need this in order for the system to remain stable and treat people justly, right? They say. Yeah. So this is also where you get the rise of labor unions and worker protections. Those are good. Those exist alongside capitalism. You get progressive taxation, and then you get social programs that are implemented to redistribute some wealth and provide a safety net for people. However, you still get programs that are typically means tested, so they're not universal. They don't go to everybody, and they usually don't want them to be too generous, just enough to stabilize society and prevent the people from revolting, right? Yeah. And prevent people from like just abject poverty and starvation, right? But it just keeps the whole system in place. But again, you still have elites, you still have wealth concentration. It's just sort of mitigating that a little bit. Yeah. On the other hand, yeah, just a little. On the other hand, you have a right-wing deviation of liberalism, we'll say, which you might call neoliberalism, or this is also like libertarianism, pretty much. This really came into the fore with Reagan and Thatcher in 1979, 1981. Thatcher 79, Reagan 81. This is an complete embrace of laissez-faire, free market fundamentalism. Like regulation and oversight have to go. It's all bad. The government should not have any sort of say in how corporations behave, right? They should not be regulated. That should all be dismantled. Every aspect of life under neoliberalism is conceived as a sort of commodity to be bought and sold. Everything really ought to be privatized, including things that you might think of as public goods that the welfare state liberalism thought of as public goods, like, healthcare, education, prisons, waging of wars, all that sort of thing, right? That the neoliberal right liberalism has basically moved to sort of just say, let's just put that all in the hands of private corporations and, just forget about the public good.
Right.
Also, we have to decimate labor unions. They're bad. You got to totally destroy them, right? So that just gives all the power to the elites and to the entities. Also want to cut social programs, eliminate welfare, and impose austerity measures. And this, it's like designed to immiserate people so they feel like powerless. So they feel just like, oh, fuck, all I can do is scrape by,
Right.
So that it has become like the sort of bastardization of the liberal project. Now, it's still keeping with that individual freedom thing, right? But remember, the individual freedom is for the capitalists to do whatever they want, right? And everyone else is immiserated under that situation. So how does that compare to like conservatism? Because a lot of times people say, well, aren't libertarians conservative? Well, they're not really. In some ways, the thing is that you got to remember, everybody's ideology is cross-pollinated with all this stuff, right? Sure. Especially ordinary people who are not theorists and who haven't thought about the history or whatever. So somebody who calls himself a libertarian might also hold a bunch of conservative views, or they might hold some socially liberal views or whatever, socially progressive or whatever views. But if you want to talk about like historical conservatism, that has basically these features. Like, it's highly patriarchal, it's heteronormative, it's committed to rigid hierarchies of authority, it's hostile to any unorthodox ideas, behaviors, lifestyles, especially with things like sexuality and family structure. It wants to preserve those traditional forms of social organization and paternalistically impose that on everyone as a way of life. It's extremely opposed to like social change, progress, things like what John Stuart Mill called experiments in living. Conservatives fucking hate that. Right. It's typically grounded on a particular religious worldview. Often you'll hear, if you hear somebody talk about natural law, that's very commonly a conservative thing. And it's basically what they say. It's like what God said. God made the law, right? Right. And that's supposed to be objectively valid, totally unquestionable, and applies to everybody, no matter who you are, what your culture is, where your background is from. Doesn't matter if you believe this religion or not. Still applies to you. Yeah. And conservative societies tend to be very nationalistic. The interests of their nation trump those of all others. Mm-hmm. So then, moving even further to the right, you get fascism. So what is the characterization of fascism? Well, first of all, it's ultra-nationalist. If you thought the conservatives were nationalists, well, we have ultra-nationalism. And that's usually based on a form of ethno-nationalism that takes racial or ethnic heritage to be the criterion of like true citizenship. Right, everybody else is a second class, if even they're allowed to live. Right. Yep. They have the fascists have like a kind of aesthetic of violence. There's a kind of militarism abroad, and then a repressive police state at home, utilizing like secret police and encouraging right-wing paramilitaries to help the state terrorize people and put down dissidents. Fascism also directs anger and resentment toward vilified scapegoats, marginalized populations, racial or ethnic groups, LGBTQ folks, socialists and communists are like standard targets. If any of this sounds familiar,
it's almost like you're reading off headlines from the news.
Yeah, well, right. And it also promises to restore the nation to some kind of glorious past. Sure. Where have you heard that before? Right.
I don't know.
So fascism is really authoritarian. It's very autocratic. It demands obedience to a single like hyper masculine authority figure with a cult of personality. It rejects the rule of law, so it's opposed to separating powers, opposed to checks and balances. There's no equality under the law. You can, if the leader wants to help his buddies and punish his enemies without regard to the law, well, that's perfectly fine. And finally, fascists weave an alternate reality narrative that they disseminate typically via some kind of state media in order to poison the information environment and gaslight anybody who tries to fact check that narrative. Interesting. So if you
fake news. Fake news.
The political theorist Hannah Arendt talks a lot about this component of fascism, which is really interesting. So those are all.
Her.
She's really interesting.
Yeah.
She's really interesting. So like those are all the sort of the ones that we have before we get to socialism, right? So what's socialism? Well, a lot of people are going to start by saying, oh, well, that's like what Karl Marx wanted. Yes, and maybe no. We'll see. So here's what I'm going to tell you that I take to be the core commitments of what I'll call libertarian socialism, or which also gets called anarchism. So here it goes. According to the libertarian socialist, capitalism is fundamentally flawed. It's an unjust system. It creates and maintains oppression and domination. Those are bad things. Okay, we should be opposed to oppression and domination. Capitalism creates those things, and therefore that's bad and it's a flaw. Individual liberty, however, in the liberal sense, the old classical liberal sense, is good, but it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Right? In order to be truly free, citizens need to be on equal footing to be able to reach their human potential. So what does that mean? Well, it might mean robust economic redistribution, universal social programs, healthcare, housing, education, something like a jobs guarantee or a living wage UBI, not some paltry little Andrew Yang thing, but like a literal living wage UBI. And so also another thing is that tacking on a minimal welfare state to a capitalist economy is just not enough.
No.
Because why? Well, because capitalists have the power to erode any meager progress, which might make social democracy ultimately unstable. And so to achieve real freedom from arbitrary domination by the forces of capital and, by other forces, we need to radically transform society so that the means of production, namely the raw materials, facilities, tools, machinery, etc., are owned communally rather than by the capitalist class. Okay, that's a really core commitment. And you'll see that Marx talks that way a lot, right? So I also believe that for libertarian socialism, democracy is understood as a way of life, to put it in the words of John Dewey, rather than restricted to the electoral realm. Okay. So that means workplaces should be under democratic control of the workers rather than bosses or shareholders. And our representatives in electoral politics have to be accountable to the people, and they should not be coming from some elite class. Okay. Like we have in our country. So libertarian socialists are also completely opposed to oppression and domination, and thus they are inherently anti-fascist, because of all these views that we've looked at, fascism is by far the most committed to oppressing and dominating people.
Right. It's the steepest hierarchy.
That's right.
Smallest.
Oh yes, it's the most hierarchical.
Yeah.
Yep. Right. Okay, and finally. That's it. That's all I got for that one. So let me stop there.
Sorry. In your opinion,
go ahead.
Not to cut you off, but in your opinion, what causes a human being to advocate for fascism, or do you think it's the unawareness that they are advocating for a fascist? Because that's what I guess I've been seeing. Why does Trump have so many followers? Is what I'm going to ask. Your opinion.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, look, here's the deal. Human beings are complicated creatures, and one of the things that people do is they tend to be a little bit tribalistic. They tend to be a little bit like they otherize people and things like that, especially if they don't have any kind of contact with those kind of people. If they don't. It becomes easy, right? So if I am somebody who lives in a rural area and there are no black people around me, there are no gay people around me, I've never seen a trans person before, right? And then I see Tucker Carlson talking about drag queen story hour or something, and I get incensed because I feel like my way of life is being under attack by this. So there's a sense in which, okay, I can't remember where I heard this. Maybe it was a podcast or something. If you guys think about like supernatural horror in like a horror film. part of what makes what makes something really weird and uncanny is that it like sort of sits on a line between like the human and the non-human or something like that. And I think that kind of the thing that the uncanniness that you feel when you watch like a scary horror movie, like a deeply unsettling, not just like a slasher or whatever, but like something unsettling.
Yeah.
I think that's the feeling that people often get when they are confronted with something that is so to them alien or otherizing, and it feels like it's an attack on their very like concept of like, oh my god, I don't even know what I'm looking at. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
I feel like
it questions
their
their nature, like what they consider to be natural. Like,
yes, right.
Which is completely subjective, obviously.
I also blame sports. I think the sports mentality. Nothing against actual physical exertions, but I just think that the human brain has been trained. It's like that Always Sunny episode where Charlie makes the fucking the play, and they're like, "Well, who are we doing this against?" Like, no, I just made a play. People just can't understand something if it's not against another group. There's a very competitive string in the American culture that I think is being pulled.
Americans love to win over other people,
even at their own expense. Even at their own expense.
Yeah, almost especially.
Absolutely.
At their own expense.
But thank you.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's this sense of like, I mean, and capitalism really does sort of accentuate this notion of everything is a damn competition, you know, and that, I mean, yeah, I'm not a sports guy at all. So, but I'm not gonna like shit on what people like. It's fine, do your thing.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, there is something weird and kind of fucked up about like how everything needs to be viewed as some kind of competition. Yeah. That's why I hate fucking Battle of the Bands.
Yeah,
that's the fucking dumbest concept ever. Like fuck that shit.
Yeah.
So So yeah. I mean, but yeah, to get back to the other thing, I think there's another component of this is that the reason that fascism is rising around the world right now is because there is a sense that demographics are changing and people know it. And white people who are on basically have gotten used to being on the top of the totem pole, and they have all these people below them to subordinate and to dominate and to oppress. They're now suddenly being like, oh shit, sooner than later, Hispanic and Latino immigrants are going to be like overtaking us in population numbers. That scares the shit out of these people. Okay, because what a sad fact about human beings is that they do tend to have this like disturbing tendency to sort of look down on like somebody else, right? As long as I'm above somebody else, I feel good. I feel okay. Right. Yeah. And then when that becomes threatened, you get that's when reactionary people start getting really violent and scary. And that's really what we're going through right now. Yeah. And it is absolutely terrifying. So
I remember
a big part of it.
I remember telling my libertarian friend, we were talking about how something, was racist or something, and they came back at me saying that it wasn't racist. And I had to sit him down and be like, it's not up to you if somebody who's another race says it's racist, it's not up to you. And they were like, what do you mean it's not up to me? I'm part of the conversation. And I'm like, no, you're not. And I'm sorry that for once we're telling you you're not part of a conversation. You don't get a say. You don't get a say in women's like bodies, like their issues and stuff. And that just offended the shit out of him. He was just beyond.
No, I mean, that's the thing. I feel like there is that total tunnel vision of the white dude who has no respect for other types of people's lived experience. You know what I mean? Uh-huh. That's just, I mean, that is, it's hard because I feel like a lot of times the kind of people that you're talking about haven't had a lot of exposure to other types of people, like I said, right? Yeah. And that makes a big deal. I mean, look, Dick Cheney has a gay daughter, right? Mm-hmm. Now, do you think that, like, that changes your view, right, of that sort of thing, and that
should,
as it should, right? Because I have a child or a family member who actually is this, and I have to learn to deal with that, and it's a hard thing for a lot of these people to wrap their head around, but eventually they do get it, and that's good. Yeah. But yet, still now you worry about all right, well let's bring the gays into the Republican Party so that they can go drop like drone strikes on Yemeni children or whatever. So I mean, there's that, right? So.
I have noticed that everyone from my hometown that has turned Trumpy. I mean, kids I used to hang out with, and I thought just as open-minded as anyone else. turn Trumpian, I'm really sure it's because they've never hung out with, done shows with a trans person.
Yeah.
They've never. It's just there's no cultural wind catching them. You know, the climate is stagnant there, and you feel it when you go back to these places, which I very rarely do. But yes, so glad I got out of there. Get your kids out of small towns, and if they are in a small town, who I'm really proud of, and I'd like to interview at some point here, are these people that are putting on the protests in those small towns?
Yes,
like those people are the real.
It's just like one person. There's like 50 angry rednecks.
I know a guy, man. That's
really.
fucking this guy that's doing it, and he's getting threatened every day, and it's just he's still doing it. Like that's a hero there to me. But
absolutely, no, that is it's a weird thing because you do see people who are in these small towns who are coming out and having a protest, even though they don't have any connection to one of these communities. Like there's no black people that live in what was the name of that little town in Ohio where all those
I was just trying to think of that.
Those right wingers came in. Oh geez.
I don't remember.
It wasn't Chillicothe, was it? No.
No. Shit, I should remember this, but
I know exactly what you're talking about though, because it got real fucking real there.
I don't know either, but it wasn't one of the cool towns in Ohio. I could tell you that.
Yeah, it wasn't too far away from here, was it?
Chillicothe.
Okay, hold up.
Almost right.
Bethel. It was Bethel, Ohio.
That's right.
Bethel, Ohio was a tiny protest of 80 Black Lives Matter folks. And there's only 13 black residents in Bethel, Ohio. It was overrun by 700 white counter-protesters armed with rifles, baseball bats, and handguns. And they beat the shit out of a bunch of people. I mean, again, this is the kind of thing that we're going to see more and more of. And Trump is really just enabling this. And I got to say, and this is for the later discussion, if he wins again, it's only going to get worse. I mean, it's going to get worse regardless, but he's going to have like full legitimization and feel like he is totally has a mandate. So
I agree with you because he's playing nice right now to win, and his nice is still fucking horrible. He's trying to once he wins and has another 4 years, and we didn't get him out of there last time. It is fucking scary, man. And it's like,
absolutely.
I mean, this podcast right here could very easily be like, nope. We're gonna see the real thing. We're gonna see the real thing. So I agree with you on that.
Yep. All right, cool. Well, so let me just the last thing I want to talk about on this topic is the question of Marxism and the difference between the type of libertarian socialism, libertarian socialist or anarchist vision that I laid out, and what's the relation between that and Marxism? Well, the first thing to say is this, that there was a historical dispute between a libertarian socialist, a contemporary of Marx named Mikhail Bakunin, and Marx himself. Bakunin saw in Marx's early writings the seeds of something that he thought was not good, right? And that is that Marx was into this idea of having a vanguard party of elite intellectuals who are supposed to be at the forefront of the revolution, and they were going to seize state power and then plan the revolution after that. Okay, and Bakunin said he feared what he called the red bureaucracy, which is exactly kind of what happened in the Soviet Union. So Bakunin was absolutely vindicated by history there, and Marxism takes many forms, just like all these concepts. It like people fight over this term. They fight over what counts as Marxist. They fight over what's true to Marx's vision, what isn't. But there's a lot, just like in Adam Smith, there's like, he's like, on the one hand, the division of labor is good. On the other hand, the division of labor immiserates and morally degenerates and makes people stupid. So like there's weird kind of contradictions or apparent contradictions in Marx that have to be sort of like worked out, and sometimes they get worked out in ways that are more akin to libertarian socialism, and sometimes they get worked out in ways that I think of as what I'll call a right-wing deviation. And I think that Vladimir Lenin is an example of this, right? Lenin, and of course after him, Stalin was way worse. He was the worst of all of them on this front. But But when people talk about Marxist-Leninism, I believe that is a right-wing deviation from socialism, right? And remember, socialism doesn't start with Marx. There's utopian socialists writing in England before him. There are French socialists. There are Russian socialists. There's the anarchist movement. All that stuff is happening either at the same time as Marx or before him. So Marx is not the inventor of socialism.
Right.
So don't let anybody tell you that.
Right.
But here's the deal. Like, when you have this vanguardism, right, it leads to party intellectuals being the ones at the top, right? And they are elites, okay? They're not the workers.
Right.
The workers are only supposed to, the proletariat's only supposed to actually get true communism, like, way at the end of the day, once the state withers away, right? Now, Marx never tells us how that's supposed to happen.
Right.
And of course, if you look at what people acting in his name, in places like the Soviet Union actually did, it didn't work out that way, right?
Right.
So here's a couple of things that I'll say about Marxist-Leninist versions of socialism. So what we end up getting in those societies, just as Bakunin predicted, is this kind of techno-bureaucratic state, right? But then the techno-bureaucratic state tends to kind of ossify, and then it's not clear how you're supposed to get from there to this stateless libertarian communism. Like, it's just, there's no method for that, right? And Marx had this view that he called historical materialism, and it's this idea that he thinks he has discovered a law of history, and he really wants to model this on like physics or something. Remember, he's writing in like the 1840s and 1850s and 1860s, and so he's enamored of like science and Newtonian mechanics and all these sort of very sciencey things, right? So he wants to have a very scientific socialism, right? Well, here's the problem with the view. He thinks that socialism will inevitably emerge from capitalism, and in fact, from advanced capitalist nations like he thought Germany and the UK, that's where it would happen first.
Yeah.
Of course, his prediction that would happen because of this law of historical materialism did not pan out. Where did the Russian Revolution happen? Well, it happened in a feudal czarist Russia. It didn't happen in the advanced capitalist states, right? So he was wrong about that, right? And so then the question is, well, how can this be a scientific law of history if it's yielding false predictions, right?
Yeah.
So that's a bit of a problem. So there's a dilemma for Marxists, and every Marxist has to deal with this. Either historical materialism has been empirically refuted by actual history, or else it is compatible with all possible future evidence, and therefore it's more like theology than like science. And I'll tell you what, if you hang out in enough online leftist spaces where people call themselves Marxist-Leninists, you will definitely see that it's a theology. It's not about a scientific worldview, right?
Right.
And so like,
well, I think the idea that politics is exclusively scientific anyway, I think that's kind of a silly notion.
I agree.
To do like the whole Ben Shapiro things, like fuck your feelings or whatever. I think that's all horseshit, because I think politics is primarily emotion and psychology and subjective thought.
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, so actually, that I think that's absolutely right. That jives with my understanding of how ethics works, which is, basically, I think David Hume was right that reason is a slave to the passions, and that our moral attitudes come from sentiment. They don't really come usually from sort of rational thought. Although I think that rational thought can shape our moral attitudes and should.
Absolutely.
But let's be honest about like where this stuff is. Where the motivation for anything comes from is from the passions, not from reason.
It's your axiomatic values, something that can't be linked to evidence.
Yeah, that's true, right? You can't really prove to anybody that like causing suffering is bad. Like, how do I prove that?
No, you can't.
You can't. I mean, you just have to kind of go there with me, and if you don't go there with me, then we can't be friends, right?
We can't.
Like, we're going to have to come to fisticuffs, right? Because there's nothing else to it, right?
Yeah, we had a long 3-day discussion with someone, Casey and I, on Facebook, and it got down because we were talking about Medicare for all, and it got down to the point where I was like, okay, we seem to be having a very, very core difference of quote unquote opinion here. And I was like, do you think people deserve to live? Yes or no? And then he came back and said, and I shit you not, he came back and said, I just don't like the word deserve. And I was like, oh,
that's right.
I was like, we're done. We're done here.
Yeah.
I throw my hands up. This is over.
Yeah, there's a point at which you just hit a fucking brick wall.
That's it.
Right? If you can't share like certain basic premises about like values, you can't have a conversation that goes any further.
Right.
And I think that anybody who spends any time on social media arguing with people, especially people who are like, on the other end of the spectrum from you politically, that you will immediately come to that conclusion.
Yeah.
I have a libertarian friend who always likes to bring up, we have conversations, and I agree with not a lot, but he's a good guy in other areas to a degree. Anyways, I'm not trying to defend being a friend with a libertarian here, I guess. But anyways, his big thing is always like, well, if you're out in the middle of the ocean, tell a shark about your rights. Like there's no rights are a human concept. I'm like, okay, still though.
Right, but we're living in a human society.
Right. Time is a human concept too, but you need to know when to fucking get to work.
Yeah.
If you're gonna, it's like
that's ridiculous.
Like all these, I know it is. It's very silly. I don't know what. Yeah.
That's weird because so a lot of libertarians will actually say something like, and it's funny because even if they're not religious, they might appeal to something like natural rights, because actually Locke does talk about that, and some libertarians who kind of look back toward classical liberalism sometimes say, well, the right to property is like a natural right. Well, where does it come from? One answer is theology, and I mean, okay, if you want to be religious, cool, but I thought you were a libertarian and you weren't
still
trying.
a man-made construct, so it's still
that's okay. Yeah. I mean, I agree with that, but the religious person wouldn't agree with that.
Right.
So yeah, no, I mean that's the thing. Like, rights are things that people give you.
Yeah.
And rights talk is important and it's good, but let's not get carried away here. I mean, it is something that you're given by a social arrangement, right? By somebody having, and that actually Hegel's pretty good on this. He talks about what this structure of like mutual recognition, right? So I recognize you and you recognize me and we recognize our claims on each other, and we both bind ourselves by the norms, and that's what generates something like rights.
Yeah.
But they don't just exist like in the ether before there is that sort of human social arrangement,
Right, exactly. Well, we're kind of pushing time a little bit, so let's. I kind of wanted to touch on the other two subjects. So, can you talk a little bit about the a modern representation of libertarian socialism, which we're seeing in with the Kurds in Rojava?
Yeah. So
is it Rojava or is it Rojava?
I believe it's Rojava.
Okay.
Rojava.
I always want to say Rojava because Spanish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. No. Yeah. They're Kurds, so they're living in between the border of Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. It's like that area which is called Kurdistan, which after World War I was totally like just divvied up, and no one gave a shit about the Kurds. They just like gave part of it to Turkey, part of it to Syria, part of it to Iraq, and which obviously is a recipe for disaster. That's like what the West did that to the Middle East, like all over the place, and it's just it just created so many problems. And so Rojava is in northeastern Syria, and it started in 2014. And it's still going on now, and it's basically it's really interesting because the leader of the movement started out by started out as a Marxist-Leninist.
Yeah.
Okay, and
then
that
was with the the KPP or the CPP.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Again, so I mean, this is something that I it only started in 2014, so this hasn't been around very long, and a lot of people don't know about it, and it's not something that I have I'm expert on, and so it's something I've just started reading about and become like, wow, this is amazing. So and I really want to do some more research, and I'd love to come back and talk more about it once I've done that.
Yeah.
But basically, the leader of the movement was imprisoned by the Turkish government, and he still is. And during that time, he started reading a bunch of different literature. He was influenced by various thinkers, one of whom was the libertarian, socialist, anarchist, he's like eco-socialist, Murray Bookchin. So Murray Bookchin is a American Jewish thinker who's not super well known, but he's really interesting, and he has some really good sort of takedowns of Marxism and
I started reading that essay that you sent me.
Yeah, right.
Really fascinating stuff.
It's a fascinating. I mean, we can come back and maybe talk about that essay alone. There's so much going on in there.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Chomsky has come out and said that Rojava has to be preserved and protected, and so he's been a big advocate of the Kurds and the Kurdish people. But yeah, it's really interesting. They have all. It's basically based on communal living. People live in these communes that are made up of a number of families, and then those communes send representatives up. There's different levels of political structure, and each one sends representatives up, and then they have a final council or whatever that deals with international stuff and whatever. But it's all very, very much this the closest thing to direct democracy that you can get to work, right? Because again, like we said, direct democracy would require every single person to stop farming and do homework on shit and figure everything out. So you do want to elect representatives, but you want those people to come from the actual communities going to be elected, and that's how their works, as I understand. So it's a really interesting contemporary, right now, kind of going on experiment. Unfortunately, it's totally under siege, and it's in Syria, where it's like a really fucked up place, and you've got ISIS, and you've got the Syrian government, you've got Turkey and Erdogan over there, harassing them and giving and attacking them all the time and shit. So they're in a really tough spot. But the fact that they were able to do what they did is just amazing and really interesting. And so it's something that I think we should definitely come back to. But yeah, it's in this tradition of, there's actually, when people say, well, there's never been any actually existing socialism of the kind that you're talking about. It's only ever been the Soviet Union or Stalin or something.
Yeah.
Right. Or Maoist China or whatever. Yeah. And it's okay, well, look, there have been examples that are based, that are existing experiments in living, as you might say, that are based on anarchism. The first of which you can go back to is the Paris Commune of 1871. And Marx wrote glowingly of it. Bakunin and others wrote glowingly of it. And that was a very brief time where basically the whole city of Paris was taken over by libertarian socialists, and they eliminated hierarchy, and everyone was treated equally, and there was just basically an experiment in this kind of living that was short-lived and was put down by the French government very shortly after, but by all accounts, it was amazing when it was going on, right?
Yeah.
That's the problem with a lot of these things, is that there are these fucked up state forces surrounding you that are going to come in and crush it and make sure it doesn't get to flourish, or that the experiment doesn't get to continue.
We talked about that a couple weeks ago, didn't we?
Yeah.
With our first guest. You've been, once again, another one of those great guests that we could just talk to for hours. We've been really lucky.
Totally talk to.
Yeah, it would never run dry.
Yeah, right. No, absolutely. Oh, I mean, and so, yeah, the other one that I want to talk about too, aside from the Paris Commune and Rojava, is Barcelona and Catalonia during the Spanish Revolution of 1936. So that was
I'd never heard of these ones.
Yeah, so Chomsky writes about this a lot and talks about how wonderful that was. Barcelona was basically collectivized, and a bunch of the agrarian areas around there were also collectivized. And by all accounts, it was really good, and it was kind of a precursor to this 60s era of free love. Everybody was just totally the hierarchies were broken down, and people were just being free, in a real sense, not this fucking bullshit that we have under capitalism, right? And so that and even so, George Orwell, who, as you know, if you ever read Animal Farm, is a big critic of Soviet style state socialism. he went and he wrote glowingly about Catalonia. So if you want to check, I would check that out. Go check out Orwell's writing on Catalonia, and he talks about how wonderful it was, and how it was the true sort of realization of what socialism should be.
What happened to it? Who fucked it up?
Was smashed. It was smashed by fascists and other factions. Franco came in and crushed everything. There was sort of Soviet aligned communist party that came in and fucked everything up for them too, because they were like, oh, you guys don't have vanguard intellectuals running everything. You don't have elites running an elite group of vanguard party members running things. Well, that's not cool. We don't like that kind of socialism. So again, these are things that I'm learning more about right at the moment, and I'd love to come back and talk about it.
For sure, definitely. I'm learning so much from you. Nothing stays golden, pony boy. It's sad, man. It's really sad.